Trade talks between China and the United States are moving forward. That despite the arrest of a top Chinese technology company executive in Canada earlier this month at the request of the United States government. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Earlier this week, Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, was released on $7.5 million bail. She will be monitored and wait at home in Vancouver for a deportation hearing. Meng is the daughter of the company's founder. She was detained by Canadian authorities on December 1st. That's the same night that the Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Donald Trump were having dinner in Buenos Aires at the G20 summit in a move to defuse trade tensions. Telecommunications giant Huawei is being investigated for violating American-imposed sanctions on Iran. U.S. law enforcement agencies claim the detention of Meng Wanzhou is unrelated to the trade dispute, but President Trump said he would intervene if that helped the negotiations. Well, there is a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our panel here in the studio. Paolo von Schirach is the president of the Global Policy Institute. Also with us, Zhang is the Washington bureau chief for Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. Joining us from Montreal, Chen Zhao is the Chief Global Strategist for Alpine Macro, and from Los Angeles, a global business executive and an expert on trade, Ryan Patal. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Welcome. Zhang, let me start with you. The arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Canada, it's a far-reaching move by the Canadians. In fact, there was an economist here in the United States who's pretty well known, Jeffrey Sachs. He called this, quote, a dangerous move. But how is it being seen in China?
I think it's very clear that most of the Chinese people believe it's an attempt of the U.S. government to work together with Canadian government, trying to hijack Miss Meng Wanzhou and to defeat or smash China's 5G technology. And I think many Chinese people are also feeling Ms. Meng Wanzhou is not breaching any Canadian law. She is being accused of breaching the U.S. law on Iran sanction. And I think this Iran sanction law itself is very much unilateral, and it's not in line with most of the countries. And so it's not fair, and most of the Chinese people believed Ms. Meng should be released as soon as possible.
Okay, let me bring in Ryan. Ryan, it seems that the United States want to use every little bit of leverage that it has against the Chinese in these trade talks. You know, as I mentioned a moment ago, President Trump has said that he would intervene in this arrest in Canada if it helped the negotiations. But what do you make of a tactic like that?
Well, first off, I think it was a mistake for Trump to say that, because I think his team was trying to keep this as a strategic separate from this economic trade war that's going on. But with him saying that, now this is crafting to be how the U.S. is obviously going to try to use this as a chip in these negotiations, and not something that, you know, when you go to tables across with China and then Canada kind of involved in this, it gets really messy, and I think it would have been best if these situations were separated. But you know, this was an opportunity, as Trump has done in his past, as using his bargaining chips.
But Ryan, I guess the person who was arrested in Canada, I mean, is Meng Wanzhou being held hostage to the negotiations?
Well, I mean, this is the first one a few times in my memory that that they've used actually a person in these kind of situations. We've seen this with products from soybeans in this trade war between the U.S. and China, and at this point of this conversation, she is a hostage in this conversation, and with President Trump coming out very clearly on Tuesday stating that he would step in, only kind of goes down that route that he would step in if it was for the greater good, and to me that sounds like a negotiation tactic.
Paolo, just to get back to Ryan's point there, this is the first time that an individual, a person, has been arrested. She's been accused of working for a company that violated sanctions against Iran. Now, there have been other companies that violated sanctions. Yeah. The American bank, JP Morgan, violated sanctions, but they were fined about $88 million. Why do you think the US is now going after individuals?
Well, of course, this is an interesting question. Of course, the timing is odd, if not suspect, as we've been saying. If this is an instance of hostage taking in order to gain leverage in a trade war, it's a horrible precedent to set. We shouldn't do. I mean, if this is what's going on, and we don't know that for a fact, but if this is what's going on, we shouldn't do that. And indeed, I read something earlier today indicating that Trump's, at least some Trump advisors said, please, Mr. President, don't get into this. Don't make any public statements regarding this matter. This is a judicial matter and should not be, cross the lines with the trade talks. Whereas now it is commonly understood that this has become part of the trade talks. And as you indicated, the United States government has used what is called prosecutorial discretion in pursuing this or that target for sanction breaches or something else. Of course, in this case, the allegation is that the CFO of Huawei lied to American authorities in explaining the relationship between Huawei and this Hong Kong subsidiary. At least this is the allegation.
Right.
Whether it's true or not, it's a different matter altogether. But again, the fact that the president comes into this conversation and say, hey, I may have to intervene in this if it facilitates the trade talks, then it gives the other side the impression that this is hostage taking. And this is not a good thing to do because it encourages retaliation. And again, it diminishes the credibility of the American judicial system because it looks like we're involved in something that's nothing to do with the law.
Talking about the judicial system, Paolo, I know you're not a lawyer, but what about the question of jurisdiction? The United States is saying that a Chinese company violated sanctions against Iran, which the United States imposed on Iran. It didn't get the agreement of China when it imposed those sanctions.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not, as you say, I'm not a lawyer, but the idea is that America has the right to pursue alleged criminals all over the world if it can catch them. And if in this case it got the cooperation, maybe the Canadians will live to regret this of the Canadian, across the border and say, hey, we have an issue with this person, detain her if she gets to you. And so they did. Again, the Canadians, based on their own system, as I understand it, have to evaluate the charges and determine whether or not this person should or should not be extradited. To my knowledge, she has broken no Canadian laws. At least there's no allegation to that effect. So she's held only on behalf of the United States. So this is kind of messy. But if the Canadians, for some reason, judge that those allegations, the charges on the U.S. side are not valid, she'll be released.
Well, on the issue of the consequences for Canada, let me bring in Chen Zhao. Chen Zhao, 2 Canadians have been detained in China on allegations that they've threatened Chinese national security. If we look at those arrests and the arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Canada, what kind of impact is that going to have on Canada-China relations?
It's going to be very bad for sure. The problem is perception here. As your previous guest said, this does conjures up the image of a hostage taking. Truth or not, we don't care. We don't know. But the timing is very suspect, and the image is very bad. And the Chinese government obviously is facing huge pressure from domestic audience. Domestic audience basically saying that this is not right. This is the wrong thing for the American and Canadian government to do, so you have to do something about it. I am pretty sure that the detention of these 2 Canadian diplomats in China have something to do with this. So I think this will create a huge headache for the Canadian government. Right now, Meng is in Canada. So the Chinese have detained 2 Canadians. So here we go. We got a retaliation. I don't know what the Canadian government is going to do. What would be the next action? Canada can say that I'm sticking to the rule of law. The Chinese saying I'm sticking to the rule of law too. So I have no idea how this thing evolved. But one thing is pretty clear: there is very little leverage that the Canada has over China. The Chinese economy is a huge economy. It's a big economy. They can operate without Canada, no problem. So the problem is really Canada got no leverage. I don't know. This is a huge gridlock. I think the Chinese government, from tactical point of view, is right to focus on Canada because that woman is in Canada. So what are you going to do?
Right.
I think I want to follow his comment. I think that, there are two things here. One is that usually, as I know, China is very, very kind of cautious not to detain any foreigners and put them on trial. Yeah. And usually when they capture these two Canadians, which means they will have a lot of evidence. This is very important. The second issue is also China has a tradition previously, I think, for this issue to be solved. If I think Miss Meng will be released from Canada, I guess Chinese court will rule that these two people are guilty, but they will be like having 3-4 year sentences and expelled from Chinese territory.
Okay.
That can be a way out.
Song Zhang, there is something else, and all this is taking place, of course, against the background of these trade talks that are taking place between China and the United States, a trade dispute.
Yes.
There is a perception in the United States that China is in a weak position right now. In fact, the New York Times concluded that China is now making concessions to the United States because its economy is in a downturn, that it is caving in to the United States.
Correct.
I personally don't. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So who do you want
Chen,
me to talk?
Chen,
you want me to talk? Yeah. Okay. So, I personally do not think the Meng's incident has a huge long-term implication on trade because, in the end, Trump want Americans to gain. In the end, President Xi Jinping wants to defuse the trade war by hiking up tariff, by opening up this trade war. No side will gain anything. Trump is not going to gain anything. Of course, China probably going to lose more, but Americans do not gain anything. The key thing here is be careful here. Midterm election, Trump, Republicans basically lost 10 out of 14 Midwest contests. And Midwest is a huge agriculture area. We know that. Yeah. My suspicion is that the Chinese retaliation through the soybeans and other agricultural products might have had an impact on that, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. All of a sudden, Midwest flipped. Yeah. So that's why I think Trump has an incentive to get a deal with China.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why he sounds. He does not sound as victorious as he was before.
Right.
For the Chinese, of course, there's a huge incentive for Chinese to get a deal with Americans because they need American in terms of economic growth, in terms of trade, in terms of technology. They need all of that. So, logical outcome is for them to have a deal. Mm-hmm. And I think Meng, in this whole big picture point of view, is a sideshow.
Okay, Song Zhang, go ahead.
Okay, yes, I think this Wall Street Journal is correct and not so correct.
New York Times.
Yeah, New York Times. Sorry. Yeah, I think China is basically a smaller economy than the United States, and we export more than import from the United States. That is correct. So China is in a little bit weaker position, but our GDP is growing at 6.5%, and US is growing at 3 or less than that. I think it's also not like China is doing very badly in the domestic economic things. But I think President Xi Jinping is looking at this issue from a more broader perspective. He is believing that a very good productive US-China relationship is good for China and for the world. And I think to do more like economic reform from Chinese side is also both meeting the U.S. demands and also good for Chinese own economy.
Right. Ryan, another way of looking at this is that it's not China that's in a weak position. It's the United States that's actually lost leverage with China. And in this respect, it's called for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Canada. But as it do you think tipped its hand with calling for that arrest?
Why did I feel like you were going to ask me that? I knew you were going to ask me that. I think I mean, if you had all the leverage, you wouldn't come out and say, I will step into this conversation, right? Would not be a tactic. And let's just assume that this wasn't a tactic and this is separate. So if these two situations were separate, the trade war and being arrested, in the judicial perspective, you'd be really clear that they are separate and that you're just going back to the trade conversation as normal. And I think this is where I believe the U.S. might have tipped a little bit of a hand that, they both, they don't have all the leverage. And I know the perception is that the U.S. or in the U.S. that they may have the leverage, but as you guests have said in the past, I believe they both need each other. And this is not the time to get into this who's got the leverage the most. We did that 6 months ago about this back and forth trade war. We went from G20. You want to build more on top of this, and I think the timing of this is not great, but this is not for either side, for China and the U.S. to not get apolitical with this and get to a deal as quickly as they can.
Right, Paolo, is this dispute more than about just the trade dispute? Is it, I would mention Jeffrey Sachs earlier on, the economist who used to teach at Columbia University. He wrote something which is very interesting. He says the U.S. conflict with China has little to do with U.S. external trade imbalances or closed Chinese markets, or even the dispute over intellectual property. It has everything to do with containing China by limiting its access to foreign markets, advanced technology, global banking services, and perhaps even U.S. universities. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's a bit extreme, but there's some truth to that. In other words, there's been some kind of a change in perspective, which is worrisome. In other words, the United States looked at China in the past as a potential partner, right? And certainly a trade partner. We know it is, in fact, but also as a sense that China's coming to us. China's reforms, the economic reforms, would also lead to other systemic changes that will make China a little bit more like us. Not that they assumed that it was going to be, a Jeffersonian democracy the way we understand it, because, we appreciate a different history, different tradition, different circumstances. But that, it looks like now they say, oh, it didn't turn out that way. Now it looks like China is a competitor. And therefore, the lenses have changed entirely. And if we remember just a speech that was given a few weeks ago by Vice President Pence, was a pretty belligerent speech. That's right. Talking about essentially a threat coming from China, not of the old Soviet kind of threat of the Cold War, but a sense that we should be worried at multiple levels. And from this perspective, also one can assume that people inside the administration look at the activities of major Chinese corporation as if they were arms of the state, and that therefore they carry out policies that have nothing to do with business and trade and developing markets and whatever, but they are in a broader sense trying to expand Chinese influence, whether it's in Asia or in Africa or elsewhere. Yeah. So that perception, I think, is very worrisome. I think it's an exaggeration. I think that there's a lot of paranoia involved, and certainly, yes, and as it's been discussed even recently, America as a country and American corporations are really concerned about these new competitors, Huawei being one of them, clearly, that out of nowhere, literally in a matter of a few decades, have become world giants, something that took American companies a century to make happen. So here's the thing. Are we headed towards this kind of ugly confrontation, or is this mostly a misunderstanding that can and should be clarified? I would recommend that the two sides not only get together and resolve the current trade dispute, but also engage more deeply in establishing rules of the road, in trying to really determine what is proper and transparent behavior that both sides are comfortable with and can live with, and that this regulates sort of the activities of major corporations in the global chessboard. Maybe this is a bit of broad agenda, but I think it's a conversation worth having. Otherwise, we will be headed for trouble.
Yeah, Chen, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, my assessment is not that optimistic, but look, be realistic. This is a rising power versus incumbent. Okay, a rising power has a totally different political system, totally different ideological belief and leaning. completely differently in terms of culture. Everything is different. I mean, the hope that China will grow more like America completely is nonsense. I mean, President Xi Jinping is reinforcing the Communist Party's rule and influence in every level of Chinese society and economy. There's no way that the Chinese over time will look more like American. The Chinese will look like more Chinese. Too bad. That's reality. So I think the confrontation, the problem between the United States and China is structural. So we have to face that reality. The question is how to contain that confrontation to the level that is acceptable to the rest of the world. The confrontation will stay and will get intensified as the Chinese economy grows bigger and more stronger. We have to face that, and they will never be growing together. I mean, too bad. That's in history, in the whole world history, there has never been dual power in the world that coexist peacefully for a long time. I'm sorry. I mean, it has never happened. So this is the first time we have these two countries that almost grows to a level that is almost in same size. Of course, the Chinese per capita GDP is only 20% of America's, but over time, the size of the Chinese economy will be bigger than the United States. That's for sure. And in that system, there's a lot of untested features. We don't know how that thing is going to evolve. Yeah. And that's naturally very natural for Chinese to be suspicious about Americans' intentions, and it's very natural for Americans to be suspicious of the Chinese intention. Yeah. I view that as a structure. I don't think it's going to go away. I'm sorry.
Okay. Ryan, if we look at some of the concessions that China has made, I mentioned earlier the trade concessions. China's agreed to reduce tariffs on car imports. China also says that it will import more soybeans from farmers here in the United States. Then, of course, there's the Made in China 2025 plan. It's a sensitive plan as far as the United States is concerned. It's created a great deal of controversy here. And China has said, well, look, it's prepared to revise that plan and replace it with something that would actually make it easier for foreign companies to invest in China. What do you make of all those moves that the Chinese have made?
Well, I think it's I think the revision of that plan is to say to China, to the U.S., you can come along with this plan versus leaving you alone from this plan. And I think the second piece is that, the rhetoric's changed, right? I think part of it here in the U.S. and the U.S. administration has been portraying China as that they are going to be independent and they don't need us and that they're stealing technology. And I think when China comes to the table and tries to make globalization a lot further in trade, I think even though it's a small thing, it's a pretty big conversation starter, and it has to bring the U.S. back to the table when it comes to that. And again, I think both countries both need each other as of right now. Maybe in the future, one or the other don't need each other, but because both economies are so intertwined, they are growing at maybe not the same clip, but they both GDP need each other. And I think until one or the other decides to not, then we have this conversation of maybe one whole superpower be at the end of the day. But I think China has been very smart thus far in this conversation. They've been really, in my opinion, not the aggressor as of right now after they ran out of the tariffs piece, correct?
Right. Paolo, we see this dispute continuing between China and the United States. But, I mean, what are the risks for the global economy? Both these countries are deeply involved.
Well, of course,
the rest of the world.
If this gets worse, everybody gets hurt. Not just the U.S. and China, and obviously both producers and consumers. As it's been said before, nobody really wins in a trade war. And I've said it before, and I repeat it now. I don't think this is a grandiose, grand plan. Mr. Trump said in the past, trade wars are great and we're going to win. I don't know what he means, and I don't know what he understands about all this, quite frankly. But of course, the rest of the world suffers. China itself, as we all know, depends on a very extensive regional supply chain. So if trade with the United States is hurt badly and sales are, there's a slump, obviously everybody else gets hurt from Taiwan to Korea to Singapore to Thailand to all the other suppliers that provide critical pieces and components that end up in many of the electronics that are finally assembled in China and then sent to the United States or in other markets for that matter. Therefore, I would say that yes, you know, and again, if you look at the jitters of the stock market, both in the U.S. and globally, is the fear of this getting worse. And if in the moment in which there is a moment of hope, markets go up. Why? Because they are afraid of the ripple effects of all this. So when the two giants in the world economy fight, everybody else suffers.
I was talking to one Japanese.
I'll get you in a moment, Chen Zhao. Go ahead.
Okay, I was talking to one Japanese friend over lunch today, and he was saying that if the two giant economies start to fight finally, and Japan will be forced to choose one side, and Japan will refuse to choose any side. And also when it comes to like even this 5G, where many people say Huawei is leading. Actually, I heard there are more than 8,000 different patents on this 5G technology, and Huawei is only having a few hundred of them. And I think many other countries, many other companies are having a lot of patents. So I think this is basically a kind of globalized, kind of interdependent kind of economy. No country will be staying away from this conflict between US and China.
Okay, Chen Zhao, go ahead.
My point here is this. Yes, it's going to be a negative if you have a full-blown trade war between the United States and China. But at the same time, you have to be rational here. We're talking about numbers here. The Chinese export to the United States is about $550 billion a year. $550 billion a year on a $13 trillion economy is about 4 to 5% of GDP.
Right.
Okay? So get the number right. So when you have a trade war, that 4 to 5% of Chinese GDP is not going to go to zero. It will get hurt. You will have some contraction. The $550 billion might go into $500 billion, maybe $450. So in terms of impact on the Chinese economy in terms of GDP, could be 2%, could be 1.5%. And that is important. That is painful, but not a disaster. It's very easy to use domestic spending to offset that. So that's my first point. The second point is, Trump is about the least ideological driven president you could probably ever find. He doesn't give a squat about ideological differences. He just cares about money. He's transactional. I think that actually create a ground for the Chinese government to reach a deal. You just want money. Let's deal with money.
All right, Chen, we're running out of time here. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.